All right, why is it not wanting to work? Okay, so today should be Wednesday. We are still looking at the Cold War. Take a break in our timeline to learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've given you a credits for where I pulled some of these slides from. Okay, so the Cuban Missile Crisis. So our timeline yesterday went from 1945 to 1965. The Cuban Missile Crisis happens in the 1960s, 1962. So if you look at this map, just as a little bit of a foundation, we know that the Cold War is this tense time period between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. Here is the islands of Cuba. And we learned in the timeline that Cuba became a communist area. So the democratic leader that was put in place by the United States was overthrown by Fidel Castro, who was a communist. So a little bit of background there and just kind of an overview of looking at, where in the world are we when we're talking about the Soviet Union, the United States, and Cuba for this Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. So, a little background, Cuba is a small island. You saw that on yesterday's. It was a U.S. ally. U.S. businesses, our military base, Guantanamo, a lot of you may have heard of that, is there. So, prior to Fidel Castro, and then he overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator Batista, and he established a communist government. And this is a picture of him. Okay. So, what's the big deal? Why is the USSR interested in Cuba at all, or even in helping Cuba? Well, one, it's a new communist state, and they're all about spreading communism, right? Cuba, with how close it is to the North America and South America, provides a launch base for USSR's intercontinental missiles, ICMs. So USSR is under a new leader at this point, Khrushchev, and he also wants to test JFK, see what he's made of, see how he's going to react to this tension of nuclear bombs. Khrushchev wants to force JFK into bargaining over U.S. missiles in Europe. So he's hoping to get the president of the United States to, take down some of the missiles that they have set up in Europe once he shows how close he can get to the United States by setting up missiles in Cuba. Okay. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is also called the October Crisis. And what happened? So this is the 14th of October in 1962. A United States U-2 spy plane takes photos of suspected USSR missile sites on Cuba. The sites seem to be nearing completion. The experts believe that they could be ready in 7 days from the time that the plane took the pictures. The planes identified 20 Soviet ships that are bound for Cuba carrying missiles. So this is an image to show you where like the range of the missiles were. So if they were set up here on Cuba, on the island of Cuba, and launched, you can see the short range missiles would go this far over the United States of America, and the long range missiles would cover almost all of the United States of America and into Canada. So most of the US cities are within that range of the short and the long range Soviet missiles. So therein also is, that's a threat. It's a big threat. What happened? Oh, there we go. So JFK, the president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, he's got to decide what to do. We've got, kind of a list of options. He could have a surprise invasion, an airstrike against the missile sites. He could have a larger airstrike against the missiles and other sites in Cuba. He could have an airstrike followed by a ground invasion. He could blockade Cuba and ask Soviets to stop working, please, on the missile sites. So that one is highlighted because that's what he decides to do. So a blockade is these dotted lines where they set up U.S. Navy ships, to kind of surround Cuba and keep these Soviet ships from being able to come in and deliver their missiles. So on the 20th of October, Kennedy decides to blockade or quarantine. You guys should be very familiar with that word by now, Cuba. On the 22nd, Kennedy publicly calls on Khrushchev to remove your weapons. Okay. Oops, I forgot to take off the April and June from the last slide deck. Ignore that right there. If we were in the classroom, we would have made this page in our interactive notebooks, and you can see how we also would have drawn that blockade around this island of Cuba. The United States has the blockade, the Soviet ships trying to come in. This is a representation of an intercontinental missile. Okay, so on the 23rd, Khrushchev refuses to acknowledge the blockade or the presence of Soviet missiles on Cuba. So he's like, I don't see these Navy ships. And, oh, what missiles? We're not bringing any missiles. We don't have any missiles on Cuba. What are you talking about? On the 24th, you have the first Soviet ships. There are also submarines with them, and they come about within a little less than 500 miles of the exclusion zone, so being close to Cuba. It's pretty close. All right. 2:32 a.m. on the 24th, Soviet ships stop and they turn around. On the 25th, aerial photos show continued construction of missile sites on Cuba. On the 26th of October, Kennedy receives a letter offering to negotiate, one of our vocab terms, over missiles in Cuba with removal of the blockade and U.S. invasion threat. So Khrushchev's wanting to kind of negotiate here. He sees that the United States has Cuba surrounded, wants to negotiate. On the 27th, Kennedy receives a second letter calling for the U.S. to withdraw missiles that we have over in Europe and Turkey. Okay. So on the 27th of October, another U-2 plane, this out, is shot down over Cuba and the pilot is killed. So Kennedy decides to ignore the second letter asking us to remove, missiles from Turkey, but he accepts the terms of the first letter, which is stop the blockade, leave Cuba alone. On the 28th of October, Khrushchev agrees to dismantle the Soviet missiles in Cuba. So if you look at this political cartoon, this is supposed to be, of course, JFK. You have all these people. You have Castro on his little island of Cuba. And then the caption says, but those behind cried forward, and those before cried back. And backward now and forward wavers the deep array. The question here is, what is the cartoonist trying to say about the difficulties facing Kennedy during the crisis? You don't have to answer this. If we were in class, we would discuss it. It's right there, of course, in the caption. Kennedy's being kind of pulled in each direction. Forward ho, go ahead and blockade and be ready. No, pull back. That's in the best interest of our country. We don't want to, go to a nuclear war. This is the closest that we came to an actual nuclear war during the Cold War time period. It was pretty much this big standoff. Is Russia going to deploy these intercontinental missiles from Cuba? If they do, are we really going to launch missiles back? Really scary time period for people at this time. And so, the President of the United States has some hard decisions to make. What is the outcome of this crisis, this close to actually having a nuclear war? Again, Kennedy agreed to the first letter, which means that we pulled out. So Cuba remains communist and heavily armed without nuclear missiles. Khrushchev pulled the nuclear missiles, did not, bring any more to Cuba. This way, both leaders, they don't lose face. They come away with concessions. They come away looking like they, actually solved this crisis. The permanent hotline is set up between the White House and the Kremlin, which is like the White House for Russia. And the supported theory of containment and coexistence builds up because the alternative of war is unimaginable. So it comes to a point in time in the mid 60s, early 60s, that the United States and Russia decide maybe both ideas can exist at the same time. Maybe Russia can be communist and we can be democratic. And that can be okay, because if we keep fighting each other, then the alternative sounds like it might be nuclear war, which is unimaginable. All right, so if we were in the classroom, this is what our little image would have been. So we would have the cause, the situation, the result, and then both sides. The cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis: the USA tried to overthrow the Cuban government because of its relationship with the Soviet Union. The situation: shipment from the USSR to Cuba increases in 1962. The CIA believed these were weapons. There was a 13-day tension between the United States and the USSR. And as I told you, it's the closest the world ever came to a nuclear war. You have the United States. We tried to invade Cuba, as you saw yesterday, with a failed attempt with the Bay of Pigs. The U.S., we have proof from the spy planes that, the USSR has missile launch sites in Cuba. We demand the missiles to be removed. The United States starts the blockade. And then the Soviet Union is sending missiles, missile technologists, and soldiers to Cuba. So it's building up, its nuclear base there, so close to the United States. The Soviets sent warships, submarines, and planes in response to our blockade. The warships would approach the blockade, and then they turned back. What's the result of the crisis? October 28th, the USSR and USA come to an agreement. The USSR would remove the missiles and launch sites from Cuba. USA would not invade Cuba. And we actually secretly agreed, if you look over here, to remove the missiles from Turkey. We didn't do that out loud, but we did that on the DL. So that would still kind of keep some peace, because no one really wanted to go to war with nuclear bombs. All right, so your turn, your task. Who do you think won the missile crisis, this Cuban Missile Crisis? Do you think Kennedy, Khrushchev, or neither? And defend your answer. Explain your answer. Use evidence from what I just showed you, or feel free to do some of your own research. So this is what you are sending me. Who do you think won the Cuban Missile Crisis? John F. Kennedy or Khrushchev, or neither? And explain your answer to me. Okay. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.